So we just covered the elicitation phase of the requirements engineering, and now we're going to go to the analysis phase. And the analysis phase is, I guess, best represented by a checklist. So I went ahead and made this checklist that we'll go ahead and call the analysis checklist. Now, pretty much what the analysis checklist is, it's, as the name would imply, a checklist that you go through to make sure your requirements are concise, make sure that you have all the necessary information, and make sure pretty much that your requirements are structured in the best way possible. So the very first thing on the checklist is premature design. And what that's pretty much asking us, do we have enough information to create an implementation? Our requirements, do they allow us to create this premature design for our implementation? Let's assume that we've already done some elicitation techniques such as interview or background reading, and we got all this information for our requirements documentation. So this is a requirements documentation, and we have all these different requirements, and let's imagine we just have enough information to answer these questions. So we're going to go ahead and say, yes, we do have enough information for premature design. The next question on the checklist is combined requirements. What that would be like if we had our requirement 1 and it was blah, 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 just some, I guess, dummy text scribbles. A combined requirement asks us, is this requirement just one requirement, or it can be split off into several requirements? So let's say that we have that and we no longer need that part right there. So we pretty much took that part of the requirement and put it into a separate requirement called requirement 2. And that's essentially what this combined requirements checkbox is asking us. It's asking if we can split any one requirement into several different requirements. So it is guarding us against combined requirements. And once we don't have any more, we can just check that box and keep going. Now, do you have any unnecessary requirements? And this would be the gold plating I talked about in the previous lecture in elicitation. Let's say we decide that requirement number 2 is just gold plating. It's some cosmetic specification we added as a developer because we thought it would be better. So instead we realize that's not what our client wants. So we're going to go ahead and delete or remove this requirement 2. Then after that, we have no unnecessary requirements. So we're going to go ahead and check that box. Use of non-standard hardware. And that's just pretty much asking, hey, based on the project, based on the requirements, do we have to use non-standard hardware? Then once you answer that question, you can go ahead and check mark that. Then conformance with business goals. In your requirements documentation, you'll have an introduction where it will state these business goals, and you want to make sure your requirements and your system will conform with those goals. Make sure they accomplish the goals that are set in place. And let's say that our requirement 1 here does satisfy our business goals, so we're going to leave a check mark there. Then next, requirements ambiguity. Now this is asking us again, can our requirements be read by 2 different people and have 2 different meanings? So is it vague enough to where there's going to be some misunderstanding? And what you want to do, you want to make your requirements very precise, not vague, very understandable. And I've mentioned a couple times throughout these lectures why that's so important. As I mentioned, I believe in the 2 lectures ago when we first talked about requirements, if we have a requirement error in the delivery phase, it is 100 times more expensive to fix it then than if we caught it earlier on in the project. So that's why having ambiguous requirements is a very bad thing in software engineering. But let's just assume that a requirement 1 is very precise and understandable. So we'll check that. Then requirement realism. And this is asking us, given the technology we're going to use, is this requirement realistic? Are we able to actually complete this requirement? And let's say that requirement 1 is fairly simple. We are just going to use simple JavaScript to code it. So we're going to check that. And then requirements testability. And this is similar to that vocabulary word we mentioned earlier on, that vocabulary word is verifiable. So this can pretty much be requirement testability / verifiability. And we're just pretty much saying, hey, can this requirement be tested? Can we say this requirement has or has not been met? And that's pretty much the whole meaning of this requirements testability. Can a requirements tester say that you have completed or not completed this requirement? And we'll say that we can test number 1. So then we check that. And then that's pretty much how you do requirement analysis. You ask these questions or similar questions to these, and once you have your answer, you can just do a checklist type of thing, and then by the end you'll have very precise, you'll have very testable, very well structured requirements for your software engineering project. So in the previous lecture we talked about elicitation, and in this lecture we talked about analysis. So we've already done 2 of the 4 phases of requirements engineering. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about specification.